Good morning, everybody. I want to thank David for the opportunity to present here some of my thoughts and ideas on Soviet operetta. Concretely, Isaac Dunayevsky's operetta Free Wind, subtitle on negotiations between belief and power. We can go on in the presentation. Thank you. Yeah. In 1937, the prominent Soviet composer of popular songs and propaganda pieces, Isaac Dunayevsky, wrote to his friend and confidant Lyudmila Reinl, I quote, "In letters we can find a lot of old dust and mold, but also a lot of shining happiness and enthusiasm of our new contemporary age. Your letter is full of the second one, which gives me precious and pleasant feelings," end quote. This oftentimes passionate and very exposed correspondence gives a precious insight into Dunayevsky's feelings as well as opinions on public life. Music historians believe that in these letters, Dunayevsky opened himself the most to the person he fully trusted. In a letter from 1949, he confesses, I quote, "My optimism is based on my work, which is accompanied by the great success that gives me, as a personality, a sort of untouchability. This external image of a brilliant majesty lives along with a turbulent inner life full of emotions, torture and torments, which continue to live on. Thanks to this life, I possess nearly full liberty, which makes my affairs, my needs and obligations free of any outside control," end of quote. The tragedy of his life comes from inside feelings, whereas his societal engagement only gives him optimism. The fact that he does not mention liberty when talking about his work perhaps indicates that he does not even begin to question the rightness of his work engagement being hand in hand with party's politics. The editor of the correspondence published in 2001, Naum Schaffer, sees the largest tragedy of Dunayevsky in his undoubted belief in Stalin. He claims that Dunayevsky was able to preserve autonomy in his work despite the agitational lyrics of his songs and despite the function that his music had, that is, propagandistic, ceremonial, etc. The editor then claims that in his songs and other music, the composer was praising happy life outside of politics, the everyday happiness he saw in people around. I find this argument a bit weak, given that what Dunayevsky himself writes in his letters offers a different understanding. Next, please. Thank you. Dunayevsky's relation to party politics was changing. While in the 1930s he never doubted the rightness of the Soviet Stalinist regime, enthusiastically joining the common effort to build new socialist men and society, after the Second World War, his opinions would change. The war experience left a serious traumatic mark on his life, as well as on the lives of many other Soviet citizens. Dunayevsky states in a letter to his friend Raisa Ryskina in 1949 that, I quote, "Our souls have not yet reached back to the pre-war state," end quote. In this period, Soviet culture changed its official orientation towards anti-cosmopolitan, anti-Semitic, nationalist, predominantly Russian nationalist discourse. It was also a period of the second wave of the extreme popularity of Dunayevsky's music, mainly thanks to the operetta Free Wind, film scores to Cossacks of Kuban, Spring, and others. The period when Dunayevsky also received his second Stalin Prize. It was during this period too when Dunayevsky's relations with the politics of the party began to grow cold. In his letters, he was often critical of the party's decisions. In 1951, he criticized the work of an authoritative journal, Sovětské iskustvo, Soviet art. The problem was an article describing his discussion with students in Nizhny Novgorod, the author of which heavily criticized some ideas in Dunayevsky's talk. In the letter, the composer then expresses his disgust at the dirty games of careerists, who he finds to be much more widespread in Soviet society now than ever. However, soon after this, Dunayevsky received his second Stalin Prize, the highest prize in the Soviet culture then, for his folkloric soundtrack of the film Kubánské Kazaky, Kazakhs of Kubaň. He comments on it, I quote, "My receiving the prize showed everyone what kind of pill my enemies swallowed," end of quote. Also in 1951, Dunayevsky stood up for his colleague, composer German Žukovský, whose opera Od všeho srdce, Wholeheartedly, was nominated for the Stalin Prize only to be subsequently withdrawn from the nomination and criticized heavily in the journal Sovětská muzika, Soviet Music, and by Composers Union. Dunayevsky gives a deterrent example of a historian Guseynov, who received the Stalin Prize for his work, but since some details in his work were found harmful by the government, he committed suicide. But despite all his criticism of the government, Dunayevsky does not appear to lose faith in communism as an idea which continued to inspire his work. In exploring private documents of the composer, academic writing on Soviet private literature might be a useful tool for analyzing such material. In writing a diary under Stalin, historian Jochen Helbeck conceptualized this field in a revelatory way. He begins by describing the prevailing narratives in Western historiography of the USSR to today. I quote, "When thinking about self-expression in Stalin's Russia, we think that the state denied its citizens the ability to express themselves, and that individuals' true thoughts and aspirations were voiced only in private rooms, shielded from the intrusive gaze of the state. We see these people as liberal subjects, individuals in pursuit of an autonomy who cherished privacy as a sphere of free self-determination. In this view, Soviet citizens surely stood in opposition to the Soviet state, given its determination to destroy their autonomy and privacy," end quote. However, this image does not match the newly discovered personal documents from Russian archives, in which Helbeck finds that, next frame please. I quote, "Many Soviet diaries were distinctly introspective, but introspection was not linked to individualist purposes. Soviet diarists revealed an urge to write themselves into their social and political order. They sought to realize themselves as a historical subjects defined by their active adherence to a revolutionary common cause. Their personal narratives were so filled with the values and categories of the Soviet Revolution that they seemed to obliterate any distinction between a private and a public domain." And he goes on. "Many Stalin-era diarists were preoccupied with finding out who they were in essence and how they could transform themselves. They put pen to paper because they had pressing problems about themselves, and they sought answers in diaristic self-interrogation. Their diaries were active tools deployed to intervene into their selves and align them on the axis of revolutionary time," end of quote. Dunayevsky's and Reinl's correspondence is predominantly introspective, dealing with their inner life and feelings, but in many places revolutionary narratives as are expressed, and they seem to be present in the background of many of the letters. Helbeck describes, I quote, "The concept with self-transformation shared by the communist regime and these Soviet diarists was rooted in the revolution of 1917, which promoted a new thinking about the self as a political subject," end of quote. This is apparent in many places of the correspondence, for example, when Lyudmila called herself a child of the revolution. Dunayevsky's self-perception is also heavily connected with the common cause of revolution and with the concern with self-transformation, mainly in the 1930s. Next, please. His belief in the revolutionary project of the new socialist man and woman is also reflected in his largest post-war piece, the operetta Free Wind, from 1947. The plot of the operetta takes place in an unnamed country on the shores of the Adriatic Sea. The satire, which is strongly present in the piece, is pointed at capitalist oppression, and the plot of the operetta is sticking with the structures of socialist realism. The plot actually bears some similarities with the situation in Greece these days. Back then. The positive characters in the operetta are mainly the main romantic pair, Janko, the young former partisan in hiding, and Stella, the daughter of a deceased sailor, represent the new socialist generation arising in post-war Southern Europe. They join the forces with the people, sailors and workers, to fight evil capitalists. Next. This is the title song from the show, representing a mass song in the canonical Soviet style. Please. Thank you. We can stop. Then the refrain comes in, and yeah, thank you. So this is a typical example of a political song from the 1930s and 40s, obviously. The music of positive characters in the operetta ranges stylistically from Viennese waltz and mass songs to modern dances like foxtrot and tango. Despite the period practice of using jazz only to depict evil capitalists, Dunayevsky employed the jazz style and modern dances exclusively with positive connotations. This approach seems to deviate from general discourse, since, as Kevin Bartik has described in his study of Soviet film music theory, I quote, illustration via stock music still pervaded. Country people got simple частушки, a short satirical folk song, and capitalists were bathed in jazz. End of quote. This technique of employing musical signs that were readable to listeners was used by Soviet operetta composers as well, going deep into the late 1950s with Dmitry Kabelevsky using a parodic jazzy number in his 1957 operetta Spring Song to depict a frivolous anti-socialist character. In The Free Wind, however, the villains are not given any musical numbers. In a letter to Raisa Ryskina, Dunayevsky stated that he felt that using music for the villain's characterization would weaken the political sharpness of the dramatic depiction. Thus, his sense of musical dramaturgy was telling him otherwise than was the common practice linked to the official discourse. Next, please. We must acknowledge that besides being the pioneer of Soviet popular songs, Dunayevsky was also one of the main agents of the import of jazz music to the Soviet Union. In the second half of the 1920s, his good friend and colleague, band leader Leonid Utyosov, visited Paris to encounter the band of white American jazzman Ted Lewis. He then imported his commercially successful style of jazz to the Soviet Union, with Dunayevsky adapting it in his compositions, namely in the film scores to Grigory Alexandrov's musical comedies Merry Fellows and Circus. This was around 1936 or 5 when, as Gleb Tsipursky describes in his article on Soviet jazz, jazz music enjoyed a peak of popularity after a brief decline due to the strong proletarian music campaign and the 1932 resolution on the dissolution of the artistic organizations. The musical comedies by Alexandrov were incredibly popular both with people and, reportedly, with Stalin himself. Back then, jazz also started to play a more explicitly political role in the soundtracks, as Dunayevsky managed to connect jazz music to revolutionary narratives of the movies. For the Merry Fellows, Veselí Rybята, he composed a march of Merry Fellows, a march tune in a jazzy stylization that would later become one of the internationally famous agitation songs. In Circus, the employment of jazz is more complex. In the story of an American variety performer, a single mother with an African-American child who immigrates to the Soviet Union to find liberty there, Jazz music provides a tool of expression for the main character to depict her feelings of an oppressed, marginalized person, only to eventually burst into a revolutionary mass song in the famous song Široká strana moja radnaja. White is my native land, very famous song. Dunayevsky's use of jazz in these scores is rather symptomatic. Jazz would continue to enjoy popularity and endorsement from the party politics during the Second World War, partly due to the political reasons of the Soviet Union's alliance with the USA and Great Britain. During those years, Dunayevsky, along with the Soviet Rail Workers Band, toured the country and composed military songs, including the famous march My Moscow and I Drove from Berlin. Next, please. 2 years after the end of the war, Dunayevsky devoted himself fully to writing his new operetta, The Free Wind, Volný větr, which is full of jazz music and modern dances, as I mentioned before, along with mass songs, Viennese waltzes, etc. The dominant discourse of the time, however, links the score mainly to the folk music of the Balkans that they found there somehow. But actually, only 2 numbers in the operetta can be described as somewhat folklore-influenced or inspired by folklore of Balkan people. This is perhaps an example of strategy to protect Dunayevsky and preserve his status by reproducing a certain safe narrative about his work, even though the music itself tells a different story. Actually, some 50% of the score shows signs of jazz influence. Next, please. We can play a little example of a foxtrot. This is waltz, and then will be foxtrot. Thank you. This is enough. However, this was composed during the period of anti-cosmopolitanism campaign, and jazz was put under a ban by the party then. Musicologist Gleb Tsipursky describes the situation followingly, I quote, "After the end of the World War II, the word jazz acquired a highly negative connotation in official discourse. The previous qualifications of Sovietized jazz and American jazz disappeared. All jazz became intolerable. The ban also strongly targeted comparatively recent dances strongly associated with jazz, such as the Lindy Hop and the Charleston. However, the prohibition extended, albeit less intensively, to the foxtrot, tango and rumba." End of quote. In this situation, the free wind was certainly a risky commodity. Despite that, it was nominated for Stalin Prize in 1948. However, this nomination was later withdrawn due to the hostile reaction of some authoritative members of the Stalin Prize Committee, namely composer Tikhon Chrenikov, of course, and the musicologist Tamara Livanova. In the vein of period nationalist tendencies, they complained that the score, I quote, has nothing Russian about it, etc. Dunayevsky describes this affair in his letter to Lyudmila Reinl. Thank you. Despite the resolution of the Stalin Prize Committee on the operetta Free Wind, the government didn't give me a prize. My frustration lasted no more than 5 minutes, and gave way to a more philosophical outlook. I don't know anything about the causes of such an unexpected outcome, and it would be next to impossible to find out. The funniest thing is that on the 19th of April, the chairman of the Arts Committee, Lebedev, congratulated me on the prize. And the newspapers had already asked for my photo when suddenly, well, it doesn't matter. Let those who lack creative spirit be said, I don't work for a prize. Free Wind is a huge success. Isn't that a prize in itself? Thank you. End of quote. We can go on. The rejection of the Free Wind in the Stalin Prize Committee took place just a few days after the infamous Politburo resolution on the operetta Great Friendship. But later that year, some very positive reviews of the operetta came up in Sovětská muzika, and the episode with Stalin Prize would not have much impact on Dunayevsky and his work's popularity. Among the numbers that would enjoy the most long-lasting popularity are the waltz duet, the song of Pepita with its Latin rhythms, and the jazzy couplets of Sailors. 2 years later, the famous Soviet jazz pianist Alexander Fassman would compose a virtuosic piano medley on themes from the operetta and record it for the official Melodia record company. Apparently, the jazz potential of the operetta was large. Thus, I argue that Free Wind marks a significant and exceptional event in the post-war history of Soviet jazz, which during the first years after the end of World War II fell heavily into disgrace of Soviet state and culture. While in popular and film music, jazz elements were being erased in favor of national or nationalistic idiom, and jazz musicians like Eddie Rosner were sent to Gulag, actually. In the somewhat overlooked genre of operetta, Dunayevsky managed to push jazz music through to a great delight of the audience. Next, please. In the correspondence, Dunayevsky greatly cherished the piece, considering it his masterpiece to the date. We can say that in his operettas he somewhat united the principles of agitation and autonomy. While the plot is typical socialist realist plot, and the title song entered the canon of Soviet political songs, the score of the operetta reveals Dunayevsky in the full range of his compositional forces and possibilities. It is apparent from his writing that he did not perceive the semantics and political connotations of jazz and Western music in the same way as the official discourse and government did. It seems that Dunayevsky felt free composing in all the different genres and styles while also deliberately employing this stylistic variety to the services of propaganda, or rather to promote the ideas of communism that he believed in. His position within the Soviet system and his popularity with people were so unshakable that he could afford to preserve this autonomy, the autonomy of doing agitation the way he felt right. Thank you for your attention.